always used to say what my parents said. I'd never say the same things. Hi guys, it's Matt Haycox here, and today we're doing part of our 5 Things Every Entrepreneur Needs to Know About series. I'm here with Anthony Maddalena. He's the founder of PowerCall Global Training, and they're a leading sales training organisation focusing on cold calling, negotiation skills, communication skills and presentation skills. So everything every business owner and salesperson needs to know. But as I regularly talk about when I'm doing my book reviews or my Monday masterclasses, I always like to say how negotiation, sales, branding, all these things, they're not just for people in business, but for people in life as well. And also, if it is in business, it's not just for the people who own a business, but for employees as well. So this is going to be really relevant to all of you out there. So I hope you enjoy it. Anthony, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
So listen, just before we get into the meat, can you just give me a bit of background to yourself and I guess how your sales career started, and I guess if you were ever bad and then got good, and how you've become the trainer you are today?
I think that's a really good question, Matt. I think all of us learn through our mistakes, and I think probably in my very early career as a salesperson, I definitely made mistakes, and I was able to kind of pull myself back up. But in terms of how I started in relation to cold calling, I began in a number of roles where I had to sort of hammer the phones and get leads for the field salespeople. And I would say there was one particular role that was a turning point for me. I was charged with making leads on the telephone for quite a large business information organisation in London. And it was quite difficult. The previous people in my role, had failed, and I was put in a little darkened room all on my own. And I think my bosses expected me to fail as well. And I didn't. And the reason that I didn't was that I put in place a methodology to make sure that I could win at least 8 C-level meetings with decision makers each week. And it kind of that, and I've never looked back since. I mean, basically my big boss in America heard about what I was doing, and she said, why don't you train the internal sales teams in the organization? So I was flown off to Singapore, and to the US to train the teams there. They had big success. And then that's how I sort of fell into training, really, just by doing things that seemed to work and other people wanted to benefit from them.
Fantastic. Well, listen, let's get into the meat then. 5 top tips for cold calling. What's number 1?
Yeah, my first one is mindset. Now, that may seem obvious, but the fact is, for some reason, a lot of individuals seem to have a kind of reticence when it comes to picking up the telephone. It's almost an activity that many people shy away from. And I think particularly many small business owners, and I'm sure perhaps you've seen it yourself, small entrepreneurs, they will have lots of things to do. So they'll tend to make excuses for not getting on the phone. They'll say, well, I've got a bit of admin to do, or I've got that meeting with a supplier to do. But in actual fact, telephone selling continues to be a very important route for many individuals to be able to promote their services and products. So the first thing is we need to change our mindset. So instead of predicting negative outcomes, which leads to something I call telephone flinch, where you kind of back away from picking the phone up, you need to be thinking in terms of what can I really get out of that call. So I know obviously quite rightly you've called this top tips of cold calling, but in actual fact I don't particularly like the term cold calling, because certainly what our training courses demonstrate is that with the right level of targeting and preparation and mindset, every call is inherently warm. You can gain something from it. So certainly that's been my experience. I found that, to give you one sort of from my own experience, there was a particular time when I'd had about 5 calls with decision makers that were very negative, and people weren't exactly putting the phone down, but they weren't being very forthcoming. And I did something that I learned from then, which helped me so much, which was that I pulled away and I said, look, I've got to have 5 to 10 minutes out here, because if I carry on like this, people are going to hear this kind of tension in my voice. So I actually went off into a breakout room and I actually meditated for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, my boss was very enlightened. He let me do that. And I came back and I swear to God, my whole energy had lifted and I was booking meetings like that on the phone. Everyone was a winner. But I needed to have that space. I needed to get my mind and my mental attitude back on track. So one of the things I share, one of the tips that I'd love to share with your viewers and listeners is something called opposition thinking. Have you heard of that, Matt?
I haven't actually, no.
Okay, it's not new. I'd love to say I created it. I didn't. It goes back to ancient India 5,000 years ago. And there's a particular community that still use it to this day up in the Himalayas, where apparently there's no crime and people have very long lifespans. And it's where something negative, a negative thought comes in your mind, you turn it round with a positive affirmation. And it's incredibly powerful and necessary to do that. And it's true of anything, not just cold calling. If you look at Wonderful Sportsmen, I saw a documentary on Usain Bolt actually recently, and he's very mentally prepared. He's not just physically prepared. So I think being able to predict a positive outcome rather than a negative outcome is very important. And obviously we don't have time here to go into all of the tools, but certainly people that attend our training courses, we do go through these tools in a lot of depth to help people stay positive.
Yeah, I mean that's fantastic tip to crack us off with. I think one of the first things I'd like to say about cold calling as well, but it's a theory that you can apply to everything. Is you call it telephone flinch, or I mean I've seen it in many of the businesses that I've been involved with. Everyone hates cold calling,
yes.
But for me it's not just a cold calling thing. We don't hate it because we hate it. We hate it because we're crap at it, or not we, but the people who hate it because they're crap at it. But they're only crap at it because they quit on it.
Correct.
And this morning I was talking with someone about confidence.
Yeah.
And basically how confidence is like a muscle that you've got to use more to kind of build the confidence and get better. And to me, cold calling, like any skill, is very much the same as that. There's no quick fix to success, but you've just got to get in there, pick the telephone up, and once you start to get those first bites of success, it'll give you the confidence to kind of carry on with it, and all of a sudden you don't hate it anymore. And why don't you hate it? You don't hate it because you're good at it. Yeah,
totally agree with you. We say that the mind is like a muscle, the brain is like a muscle in our training courses, and it's true. You have to practice positive thinking the whole time. So as soon as you're aware that you're having a negative thought that might lead to self-limiting behaviours, you have to kind of weed it out, like as if you're kind of cleaning your garden of weeds. And it's very important. It's very, 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 very essential to try to do that. And I agree with you as well. I think you build up a momentum. I think success breeds success. The reason why people aren't very successful at cold calling is because they don't really necessarily fully know the skills to do it. But I think also, as you say, they don't have control of their mindset around it. So for instance, calling it cold calling in the first place, I think is actually not a positive thing. I think we need to think about it as business conversations, for instance. That's what I call it. And I think the other problem, the other obstacle, which I don't think we've mentioned, that certainly entrepreneurs and maybe small business owners suffer from, is that they're so emotionally close, aren't they, to their products and to their offerings, that there's a tendency for them to fear rejection all the more than if they were working for a big sort of faceless corporation. And I do understand that, but it's about taking the negatives and turn them into a positive. So the fact that they are so close to their service or their product means that there's a lot of passion there, and passion is really what sells, I find.
I mean, I mean, for me, that goes on to as well. I think the more passionate about your product you are, the longer you tend to be in that position.
Yes.
And I think for me, another big problem with cold calling, which is a reason why people almost don't get better at it, is because I mean, maybe it's a UK perception again, but it's also almost seen as a menial task. It's entry level sales. You start as a cold caller, and once you've bashed the telephones, you then kind of move on to the next level. But that next level then invariably doesn't involve the cold calling. So the skills that you've developed to kind of get you good at it, you're now not using anymore. And then the organisations bringing in new recruits who are probably crap at the cold calling because they haven't had the experience to do it yet. And it's almost like a vicious circle that never gets better.
I think that's spot on. I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, one of the things that I do is that when I go when I'm delivering my courses, when I round off the mindset section of the course, I talk about pride a lot. And certainly when I'm, let's say, training a large team, I'll say to them, look, please don't let anyone make you feel that you're not the most special or important part of the sales process, because without what you do, the field salespeople couldn't actually do what they do. You are actually filling up the lifeline, the pipeline of the organisation. So that's one. But you're right, and also, again, I've done this all around the world, in the US and Asia, as well as all over Europe, and I agree with you. I sometimes think that cold callers are treated very much as second-class citizens. We need to change that.
Cool. Well, I guess all good comments there, and they all feature back to the kind of key word of mindset. So that's point number one. What's your second top tip for cold calling success?
Number two is the first 10 seconds of the call. It's really the make or break time. I think this is where a lot of cold callers fall down. I think you and I know very well that people's attention spans are getting less and less. I myself have the attention span of a gnat. I get bored very easily. And so we need to be saying and doing things to engage our clients very, very early on in the call. I mean, obviously as you and I know, I think social media has changed things a lot in terms of people feeling a little bit more bombarded and as if they don't have as much time for things. So we need to be doing certain things. I mean, the first thing actually is nothing to do with what we say, and that may come as quite a surprise for some cold callers. But in actual fact, it's the tone of our voice. That is the thing that the person on the other end of the phone, if they don't know us, is buying. Do I want to continue talking to this person or not? So what they're actually doing, the client, is listening to that tone. Does this sound like a consultative person? Does this sound like a professional person? Does this person sound aggressive? Do they sound robotic? Are they pushing things onto me? And of course, no one likes to be sold to. They don't like that hard approach or that dispassionate approach. So that's the key thing there with tone.
Tell me, where do you think the lines crossed from kind of confidence to bullshit?
Yeah, well, very, very good question. I think that usually the BS part comes in when people try to presume to know things about a client and they haven't prepared carefully enough. And the BS also comes in where we, in a very untargeted and unstructured way, will call a prospect up and bombard them with lots of useless information about our features and benefits, when the prospect is thinking, hang on, why is this guy or girl talking to me about all of these things? Because I don't necessarily need them. So that comes on to targeting, which is also part of the first 20 seconds, how we target that time. So that's where the BS element, I think, comes in.
And following on that kind of BS line, when you're talking to a gatekeeper, if your first point of the cold call is to a gatekeeper,
yes.
What's your view on kind of how to get past that gatekeeper? Yeah. And again, talk about confidence versus bullshit. Would you be advocating that you pretend to know the person, know the person that you're trying to get to? Do you call him by his first name only to kind of indicate familiarity and try and doorstep them?
In actual fact, I will be honest with you. Some of the people that I train do swear by those techniques and they do use them. I tend not to myself. I don't necessarily disparage those techniques. I do think that, if I may, I feel that term gatekeeper sometimes doesn't help us. Remember, coming back to mindset, if we view the person who's the secretary, let's say, as a gatekeeper, that will then change how we relate to them and our behaviour towards them. And very often we become maybe a little bit pushy, a little bit aggressive with them. And I think it's, for obvious reasons, counterproductive, because they have very long memories and they're going to bar us. So very often I find that gatekeepers are actually surprisingly helpful if you're kind to them, and I really think that's very important, that an element of humanity needs to come into it. However, should we say too much to them at the beginning of a call? Absolutely not. Why? Because if we give them too much information for obvious reasons, they'll start making decisions about the value of our service, and they may block us, no, he's not interested, or they may, of course, push us down the food chain, which is in a different way just as bad, really. So I tend to err on the side of wanting to be rather succinct with them to begin with, but respectful and friendly, and just see if they'll put them through. Two things. If someone says, what's it about? You need to have a very simple sentence put together. The cardinal sin, is pitching a secretary, and I hear it every day. If I got paid £1 for every time I go into an office and some poor salesperson is pitching a secretary, and I'm just thinking you're digging your own grave there, that's no good. So we need a good sentence there for what's it about. And then there is a good tip for, has he spoken to you before? Now, I don't personally advocate lying. And when I was young and inexperienced, I used to do that, and I used to fib. And then it was embarrassing because I would hear the secretary talking to the decision maker, and then she'd come back and say, he doesn't know you from Adam. And then it was really awful because I couldn't go back. So what I tend to suggest is to say something like, well, I haven't spoken to him myself, but I think it's highly likely my colleague may have done, and I just don't want this to drift. And that's great. You're planting without really lying. You're planting the seed in the mind of that secretary that there might be something there that needs following up. And that then will encourage her to put you through. And in 15 years, that's never failed for me, that technique, once.
Perfect. Point number 3.
Yeah, point number 3 is, of course, questioning skills. This is something that many cold callers do not do enough of. That's why the BS comes across, because unfortunately, part of the BS thing is that it's almost like that old school of selling, isn't it? Where you practice in front of a mirror, you know, you've got your patter off, it's a wonderful spiel, you're ready, rearing to go to make a sale. And of course, none of it's relevant, you know, to the prospect. So this is the point. What we really need to be doing, I would say, rather than having a kind of a script of features and benefits, especially features can be very negative very early on in a call, is what we really want are carefully structured and tailored questions to really get the mental juices of the prospect going, to engage them in a two-way conversation, which of course is what consultative as opposed to transactional selling is. Now, I'm sure you're well aware of the difference, but for those that maybe are less aware, transactional selling, of course, is where I push things onto you. I call you and I say, hey, mate, I've got this wonderful bottle of water here. It's the best bottle of water in the world. Buy it now. I'll give you a discount, blah, blah, blah. Never mind the fact that you don't drink water, you don't like water, you have no need. And of course, it's like I'm shouting in your face. But a consultative person would open the call more around, tell me about your views on mineral water. What is it you like about it? What don't you like about it? They're interested to kind of get the take from the other side so that it becomes this wonderful two-way conversation. So I talk, and we talk passionately at PowerCall training about high gain questions. I mean, some people call them power questions. I call them high gain questions. So these are questions, for instance, you've got to obviously think about your audience when you're putting these questions together, but obviously with clients, we do help them do it. But for instance, if you're talking to, let's say, a sales director, and I'm very fortunate in that I do sell usually into sales directors, which are a wonderful market to sell into because these are individuals that very often do want to talk and tend to be very lively individuals. But one of the first questions I'll ask them is, you know, how are you staying ahead of your competition? Great question for a sales director, because what sales director is ever really happy with what they're doing? What sales director isn't thinking about their strategy for getting ahead? So it's a great question. And because also it guards against the cold caller talking too much at the beginning of the call. I used to have a wonderful boss, actually, a big entrepreneur like yourself who lives actually down the road. And he used to say to me, it was wonderful advice. When I was on the phone, I used to speak a bit too quickly because I wanted to get my message across. And he'd say, oh, for God's sake, Maddalena, slow down, Maddalena. And he was absolutely right. I mean, I was just speaking at a rate of knots without realising it, completely boring the pants. Off my prospects. And as you and I know, as Oscar Wilde said, there's only one unforgivable sin, and that's to be boring. And sadly, we do very often bore. If we do those sorts of things, we certainly will bore and lose our prospects. So just by slowing down and asking a strategically placed high-gain question at the end of our introduction, and also the introduction, by the way, it should have a hook in it, a trigger. Why are you calling them? What is it about them that you found that might perhaps indicate a possible fit? And you need to communicate that to them.
Fantastic. Okay, top tip number 4.
Yeah, top tip number 4 is listening skills. I think that many of us do not listen perhaps as well as we might. There was a rather horrific study that was published in the 1970s, but still I think so holds true today, which demonstrated that human beings listen usually at about 30% of capacity. Right. Which is pretty low, and that we do that. Sorry,
well,
yes, go ahead.
I was going to say, I guess in today's more urgent technological, social media world, it's going down again. I mean, I know, I always laugh when I say things like this to my daughter. It makes me feel old, and you always used to say, when my parents said that, I'd never say the same things. But that kind of old wives' tale, or old adage of we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Yes,
and they should be using that proportion. But yeah, I mean, all the time, I'll get sales calls, or not just sales calls, but I guess calls from people who you don't know, who just waffle.
Yeah, horrible, isn't it? And you just want to get rid of them, and you don't want to be rude, but it's like they're just yabbering on. But no, you're absolutely right. It's like what salespeople and particularly cold callers need to remember is that when they're asking an intelligent question and the prospect is talking, they are in control. But we think that we're in control when we're selling them lots of features and benefits and we're talking. And it's completely the other way around. When you're involving the prospect in a partnership, when you're engaging them in a two-way transaction, then of course you're in control, and it gives you more information that you can then work on. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and whether it's cold calling or the sales process in general, for me, that kind of consultative process, that customer engagement is absolutely paramount to getting success. I mean, I talk a lot about how my view of a salesperson is that if your product isn't good and your service isn't good, okay, fine. There might be one or two magician snake oil salesmen who can sell ice to Eskimos. But the reality is that today's customer is so much more knowledgeable. But before you even speak to them, they know if they're in the market for a particular product. They probably know what the pricing is. And for you to think that you can over talk them and waffle them and make them buy something they don't want to buy, for me it's a complete lunacy.
Yes, and perhaps excuse me for perhaps going back to an earlier point, but one thing just to fit in with what you're saying, which I totally agree with, is timing is of course essential. So that brings us back to the first 10 seconds, which is finding a hook for the call. So for instance, one of the things I do, and a tip that perhaps some of your people might find useful, is that I try to spend at least 30% of my time calling people who are completely new in their role. Can you guess why I do that?
But I would assume that they maybe want to make their mark and use your service and I guess prove themselves in their organisation.
Spot on. They will be much more approachable and amenable to you going in front of them. I mean, I've known individuals who were very new in their role who had perfectly good suppliers giving them a fantastic service, and simply because they were new and wanted to make a statement, they got rid of these fantastic suppliers and actually very often got other people in the... Well, it's another story as to whether or not they were as good, but let's just put it this way, they would get rid of perfectly good suppliers because they wanted to make... It's a bit like when someone buys a house. Who do you know that buys a house and doesn't change the decor immediately? Very few people would do that. But coming back to listening skills, yes, what we need to do is try and kind of reduce the internal distractions. By that I mean, very often if we're on a telephone call with someone, we're thinking what to say next. We're planning our call because we want to look as credible and as compelling as possible. So we will be planning that, but that takes away focus from the person that's speaking. Equally, there might be a drill going off or a helicopter above or something like that. And again, we get rather distracted. So what happens is we're losing vital signals and precious information from the person that we're speaking to. So we then have to do that and then place full focus on the person that's speaking to us. Then we encourage them, as you have, with me during this conversation. You'll be going, yes, tell me more, whatever. That's exactly what a good active listener does. You'll encourage that person to speak. And then because we've picked up on signals that we might otherwise have missed, we're then back to questioning skills. We can then shape better, more intelligent questions that will get us the information that we need to match the needs and promote something which is much more valuable to that person, to add value to the conversation. But the other thing as well, and it's also linked with listening, is pausing. We need to leave more pauses when we're speaking, more silences. There was a book, I think, published recently called The Power of Silence, which showed that UK business is losing billions of pounds a year because, unfortunately, salespeople don't know when to shut up. And it's very, very true. If we leave a silence just a little bit longer than we would normally, it's amazing what that silence is filled with. Perhaps some of the best information that we'll ever get. So that's another tip.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we've only got time and space for one more top tip. So what's it going to be?
It's objection handling. It's just really, obviously very simply, being prepared for the kind of objections that your prospect is going to throw at you. It obviously depends on your type of industry and your type of service that you're offering. With some of my clients, it's amazing. They'll give me examples of objections that their cold callers are facing that I've never even heard of, but I'm very often able to tailor and prepare a response for them. But we need to anticipate objections. We need to be ready for them. And the first thing that we need to do with them is to accept them and to empathize with them. So, for instance, if someone says to you, "Oh God, your service sounds expensive," the best thing that you can possibly do is, well, other people thought the same thing, but let me explain. Take it on board. I'm busy, someone might say to us. Oh, you're busy? Gosh, I'm busy too. That's why I'm calling. I don't want you to be as busy as you are. Take it on board. You then go some way to neutralizing the objection by empathizing with it immediately. Then the next thing is just to try to think about the reasons why people are objecting. And that gives you the clue as to how to answer. So let me take a typical one. I'm not going to go through them all as we don't have time, but let's say I've no budget is one that we often hear. I mean, it's often with the greatest of respect to our prospects of fib,
Yeah.
as you and I know. So what we might do there is, why is that prospect objecting? It's because they fear rather, that they're talking to a stereotypical 1950s salesman or woman who is going to knock them over the head with a contract and say, sign here. So that's why they're pushing back on money. So what we then say is, we're not about the money, we're about the relationship. That's why we're here. So my response to that is usually, look, let's park the money to one side. It's not about that. I want to get to know your business better, so when you are in the market looking for another supplier, you'll be a little bit better informed. And anyway, I have some insights that I want to share with you, which you'll be able to get some value from immediately. And that's the other tip, by the way, that I want to share with your listeners and your viewers is, always, if you're looking to book a meeting with a prospect, offer insights, offer knowledge. There's a particular entrepreneur like yourself in the US who's very, very successful. And he said recently, I think it was on LinkedIn, that he only takes meetings with cold callers if they will offer him insights and knowledge, free knowledge. Then he'll do the meeting. Otherwise, he's not interested. And so I think that might be a useful tip.
Right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that, and thanks a lot, Anthony, for your 5 top tips. So you guys need to go and watch this again if you need to, and make sure you write down and start applying all of those tips straight away. But I'd just like to say in closing as well that, you know, no matter what line of business you're in, if you're making cold calls, I guarantee that you're not making enough of them. So as good as Anthony's tips are, and I'm sure they're going to help your success rate, there is no shortcut to success on this. And as I talk about all the time, you know, it's a numbers game. You know, however much effort you think you're putting in, you need to be putting in more. So go away, hammer the telephone, start an hour earlier, finish an hour later, and apply what Anthony's got to say. Anthony, thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.
And guys, we'll see you again with some more great tips from our next guest next week. So make sure you subscribe to YouTube and follow us on all social media. See you soon. Anthony, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.